Hello and welcome to Sam Not So Wise. I've got a big one for you today. It is my top 10 sci-fi books of all time. So I am a reader of both sci-fi and fantasy, but to be honest, I don't think I will ever do a fantasy top 10 books because I just find it way harder. You know, for me, I think of fantasy and I think of these great big long series, and because my memory is so awful, they kind of just blend into one. And I find it hard to distinguish between the books and remember individual books in a 14-book series or something like that. So this was less the case with sci-fi, although there are some series that I read. It was just a little bit easier to choose my top 10. So that's why I'm doing this today. Now I say easier, it was by no means easy. You know, this was a very hard list to make. And as with any top 10 list, this could change at any time. You know, next week it could be probably the same books, but in a different order, or maybe some of the honourable mentions would sneak in. But you know how this works. Now, I only really have one caveat. If there are books from a series, I'm only doing one book from a series, but I didn't stop myself from having the same author more than once or anything like that. I'm not going to go into the books in any detail, really. I'm just going to talk about why I like them and why I think they should be on my top 10 and why maybe you should read them. So with that, and probably, as we know me, much further ado, let's talk about my top 10 sci-fi books of all time. So sneaking its cheeky little way into the top 10, at number 10 we have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I've almost read all of his books, and he has kind of two sci-fi books. This is one of them. This was the first book I ever read by Kazuo Ishiguro, and at first I really liked it, but where this book really came into its own was when I reread it. Now, this is sci-fi with a very little sci, so there's not really that much sci-fi in it. There's just one element in it, and it's kind of very much a spoiler to talk about. You kind of find out through reading the book. And that is what makes this book so brilliant, and just Kazuo Ishiguro's writing in general. He kind of has these elements in the background that aren't really being talked about in the foreground very much, and you just kind of have to find out over time through reading. And there's always this kind of weird, creepy atmosphere that is going on that you just have to read through the book to find out what's going on. And upon a reread, you really see the seeds being planted for what is coming. But what I also love about this book is it's very emotional, it's very personal, it's very much about the people and the characters, and it's just asking basically what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human. And you know, how can you define that, and how can you treat each other right depending on how you define this. It's very short and it's beautifully written, and I could read this again and again and just probably find more from it each time I read it, and that is a sign of an excellent book. So for some people this is their favorites. This is a great thing about Kazuo Ishiguro, that he, like, everybody has a different favorite. This is probably one of the most popular ones, and for me it is my favorite of his. I highly recommend for a low sci-fi book that you read Never Let Me Go if you have not. At the 9th place spot, we have a book by my favorite author of all time. And if you've watched my channel at all, you know it is Iain M. Banks. But what's it going to be? It is not a culture book. It is a book I read just a couple of months ago, making it straight into the top 10 from the read, and that is The Algebraist. So Iain M. Banks is my favorite author of all time. He has written my second favorite series of all time, so a little spoiler ahead for what's coming up. But this is a standalone, so it's set outside of the culture, but it has all of the hallmarks of Iain M. Banks's brilliant writing. His world building is out of this world. His character work is brilliant. He has very philosophical musings within this book, lovely writing, very varied. It's a fun, action-packed book, but it is full of depth as well. Now, this is space opera at its height. It is just so all-encompassing, you know, it's that galaxy spanning. We have huge worlds, we go into gas giant planets, we have amazing aliens, very interesting, and the story is just really fun. And through all of it we have Ian M. Banks' signature humour. He is just such a brilliant writer. He always gets me thinking, he always gets me smiling, and he just always gets me interested in reading the next page. So this is one that is not really talked about very much in the YouTube sphere. So I highly recommend that if you are a fan of big space operas and crazy aliens and crazy world building, that you pick this up immediately. It is a chunky boy, but you will absolutely fly through it because it's just addictive. He is an addictive writer, and I just highly implore more people read this book and Ian M. Banks in general. Number 8 is another fairly recent read for me, as I read it last year in the summer and was one of my favourite books of last year. Number 2, I think, I can't quite remember, you know how top 10s work, as I said earlier, and that is The First 15 Lives of Harry August by Claire North. So going into this book, I expected to enjoy it just based upon the premise itself, but I wasn't expecting to love it this much. I wasn't really expecting it to be a top 10, but here we are. It really made an impact on me, and it is just because it is just so fun. Now, it's like Groundhog Day, but Groundhog Life. So Harry August, when he dies, he basically wakes up again and lives his life again. At some point, he meets some other people that are like him, who have these kind of lives. And they are of varying ages, and this allows them to be able to play with the timeline. So somebody who is old when he's young, he can say, do something when you're young to affect the timeline so that when he wakes up again, it's different to how it was before. So as you can tell, it gets a little bit messy. It's fairly complicated in that way, but I like that. It's a challenge, but it's not overly challenging. You won't get completely lost. And it's just fun to move around the timelines. It's kind of time travel in a very different way, and that's just exciting. And I just find the premise really fun and interesting. It's a fast-paced book, but don't let that fool you into thinking it is a shallow book just because it's timey-wimey and fast-paced. It is full of depth. It's full of big questions about humanity and things such as, like, can you do something that is morally repugnant for the greater good? Things like that. You know, I know that's kind of quite airy-fairy and all over the place, but this book does go quite deep into the themes, and it is very beautifully written. Claire North knows how to write. So if you just want a one-off, fairly short book that is exciting, different, and just really fun, but also has the depth if you want that there, I highly recommend you read The First 15 Lives of Harry August. It is brilliant. So in at number 7, we have a book that is quite highly regarded within the sci-fi community, and that is A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. A fascinating book. So what I take from it, what I remember, it's been quite a few years now, is that it has 2 key aspects to this book. And one is the high sci-fi concepts. So for example, the zones of thought is what they're called, and that is something that, so depending on where your planet lives within the galactic ring, it affects your intelligence. So you can go from hyper intelligence to very basic intelligence depending on where your planet is situated within the galaxy. And I find that a very unique look, a very unique concept that I haven't really seen anywhere else. Maybe it exists somewhere else, I have no idea. Let me know if it does, but I've not seen that anywhere else, and it's just a fascinating concept to explore. We also have things like AI and spaceships and all the good stuff that you get with, a space opera. But what really shines in this book for me is the alien culture, and they are called the Times. And in a way, I've said this before, it kind of reads like a fantasy book because their society feels like one that you would read in a fantasy series. So they are kind of on the lower level of intelligence, kind of like us, but maybe 1,000 years ago. So you have this kind of feudal type system. So it reads a lot like those old fantasy books. I would recommend this for somebody who loves fantasy but is trying to get into sci-fi. I think it would be a nice crossover. So you have the hard sci-fi, but also this kind of feudal system. But also These aliens are quite unique. I've not really seen anything like them before. I don't really want to tell you why. I think it's good for you to maybe go in blind and learn about them just through reading the book, because they are extremely fascinating. So this is very highly regarded for a reason. It is an absolutely fascinating book, and I would love to reread this at some point soon. So, number 6. Now, everybody cheats on a top 10, right? This is my big cheat in here, because at number 6, I have The Commonwealth Saga by Peter F. Hamilton. Now, this is 2 books, but why I'm putting it together is because, for me, in my mind, this is just one story. It's not 2 stories that have, a link in between. This is just one story, and because of the size of these guys, you can't possibly print a book that is 2,500 pages long, So in my mind, this is just one story. But if you're going to make me pick between the 2, I would probably just say Judas Unchained, because I feel like it wraps the story up really well. Now, my favorite word to use when I am talking about a space opera, hi Gav, is bombastic. Now, this is a bombastic story. It is huge. The world building is epic and expansive. It's talking about our society a little bit further in the future after the invention of wormholes. So we are expanding our reach out into the further galaxy. And by doing that, we come across an alien species. Now, they aren't particularly friendly, but again, like I was talking about with A Fire Upon the Deep, I found these aliens to be really kind of unique and interesting, and their mindset to be kind of just completely alien. You felt these were very, very alien. But also what I love about this story is it is just fun. It's a really fun story. There's a lot of mystery behind it as well. And just the world building is epic, like I said. The characters as well, there's a lot of character growth. You'd expect that in a lot of pages. Some of the characters are a bit bland, but then we have some really colourful characters that go through massive changes, wonderful arcs. I just found this to be really fun. Maybe not the deepest books in the world, but just if you love space opera, this is just a wonderful example of the genre. And they are absolutely massive, but you just get a lot from them because of that. So I highly recommend Peter F. Hamilton's Commonwealth Saga. I really need to get to more Hamilton in the future. So into the top 5, and at number 5 we have Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, one thing we can all agree on is that spiders are wonderful, right? Everybody loves spiders. No, honestly, I hate spiders. I am quite pathetic when it comes to spiders. I will happily agree that. But that didn't affect me in this book. My arachnophobia didn't really come into fruition when I was reading this. I kind of want to be friends with these spiders. They seem pretty damn cool. So this is an evolutionary sci-fi book. I've not read many of them. So this is my prime example of that subgenre of sci-fi. So basically we have these spiders who are infected with a virus that enhances their evolution. So we get to watch their evolution over a period of time that would be shortened compared to like how our evolution went, as we see them gain sentience and intelligence, and their society builds and grows into a point where they can basically start wondering about why they are there and looking out into the greater cosmos. And we also have a story as well about kind of the survival of the human race going in tandem. But really where this book shines is the spiders. And I think this also sets up the rest of this series. So it's a trilogy. They're loosely linked, but I think it sets up the trilogy really well as well. I just find it amazing how attached I got to some spiders. Now, some people might bounce off of this because it is quite scientific. This is sci-fi with a capital Sci. So some people might not enjoy the scientific parts of it. There's not really much character growth within it, just by the nature of the storytelling of this evolutionary journey. So you might like some of the human characters, but again, honestly, I can mostly just remember the spider parts. So if you want something a bit different, a bit sciencey and very spidery, definitely check out Children of Time. So number 4, we are getting into some big sci-fi hitters right now, and the keen-eyed among you will notice something has disappeared from my shelves, and that is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. A lot of people's favorite sci-fi book or favorite book of all time, and I can completely understand why. Now, honestly, when I read this book, I really enjoyed it. I probably wouldn't have put it this high though. So this is not a book that has decayed in my estimation over time. It has only gone up. It is one of those where the more you think about it, the more impressive it seems. And I think that has a lot to do with its structure, you know, the framed narrative and the 7 embedded stories and just how they all link up. Now, this book does end in kind of, maybe not a cliffhanger, but not like a perfect, neatly tied bow, but I kind of like it when books do that. But everybody talks about the 7 stories within this, but I also really enjoy just the framed narrative as well, as it gives us a lot of context about what's going on. But of course, the 7 stories, every single one of them is good. We all have our own favorites, and just the variety of writing within this is absolutely just very impressive, really, how he can write so differently in these 7 stories. And the world that is set up in this is just fascinating, and it's all to do with this scary motherfucker right here, the Shrike. It is probably one of my favorite sci-fi characters, villains if you want, just depending on how you look at it, that I've ever read. Just the mystery that is built up through these 7 stories is absolutely gripping. Every time there was a mention of the Shrike, I was just like, yes, let's learn more about this, because it's just fascinating, really mysterious and scary. Like, this has real elements of horror within it, and I was gripped. I really like the follow-up as well, but I think this is where Dan Simmons has shined within this series. Not that I've read the Endymion books, which I know I should, and I will at some point, I promise. But yes, Hyperion deserves the hype. It is my number 4. At number 3, we have an author that is just sneaking up my favorite author list the more I read from him. But this was the first one I read from him, and is still my favorite. And that is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. Now, something you may notice from this list and the next book as well, is that I love books that play around with structure, things that are, really experimenting with how they are telling the story. And this book is just a prime example of that. As similar to Hyperion, we have like a bunch of shorter stories that are connected in some way. And the structure of this book goes, we have the first half of each story going in chronological order. We have a central story that tells the whole story, and then we go backwards in time through the second halves of the story, and they all have a very small link. It's just a really fascinating way of telling this story, and all of them are interesting. We will all have our favorites, but I found all of them to be compelling. A lot of people struggle with the first one and are like, I need to dip out of this because it's not what I was expecting. But I promise you that if you read on, you will be gripped by the other stories and be interested in where the story's going. And then when you come back to them, you'll just be excited to finish the rest of the stories. And this is just full of thematic work and brilliant character writing. Mitchell's character voice is just wonderful. I feel like he really gets humans. It's just fun. A really interesting, fun book. If you've not read Cloud Atlas, I really implore you to give it a try. It is not going to be for everyone, but I think you owe it to yourself to find out, because it could end up being one of your favorite books of all time, like it is for me and like it is for so many people. Cloud Atlas is number 3. So as we get to the last 2, people who have watched my channel for any amount of time will probably be able to guess which 2 they are, or an educated guess. But which order? So it's Ian M. Banks. Ian M. Banks is at number 2. He is my favorite author of all time. He wrote my second favorite series of all time, which is my favorite sci-fi series of all time, which is The Culture. So which book is it? It is The Use of Weapons. And again, like I was saying with Cloud Atlas, the thing that I really enjoy about this is the structure of it. It's a really unique structure where we have one story going forward in time and one story going backwards in time. And we're learning more about one of the main characters' past and how it has affected him, you know, into the future and the present. And this is just wonderful character writing. It is wonderful sci-fi concepts, very deep in thematic work. Again, classic Banks humor and just brilliant writing and deep thinking. And, you know, I read this for the second time in a buddy read with a couple of friends, and we had some problems with the ending, but the more I move away from that, the more I think that we are just kind of nitpicking too much, and it is meant to be somewhat left in the open. I think Banks really likes to give us some kind of, not an ending that is clear and obvious. He wants us to think about things and make up our own mind and maybe just read it again and see what we can get from it the next time. And that is exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't because I didn't have time, but the first time I read this book, I remember when I got to the end, I was just like, wow, this is just a genius piece of work. And I still think that. I still think this is just a wonderful piece of art that is testing the boundaries of what literature can do, of what sci-fi can do. And I think that Iain M. Banks is an absolute master of writing, and especially sci-fi. And I just really implore everybody to go and read The Culture and tell me what you think about this book, because it could be divisive, but I loved it, and it is my number 2. So seeing as this is a top 10 list, we need some honourable mentions. So here are a bunch of books that didn't quite make it into the top 10, but on any other day could do. You know, if I was making this list again in a month, maybe they would make it on, or upon a reread, they may well get into that 10th or 9th spot, or even higher, who knows. Now, the obvious one to mention is Dune. I really like Dune. I've read it twice, but for me, there are just a few things that aren't really to my taste, so that's why it doesn't get into the top 10, but I respect this book. I respect this series a lot and really enjoy it. You know, Paul is a fascinating character with an awful name, and the world is very interesting and unique. And yeah, Dune is great, obviously. Alistair Reynolds, an absolute stalwart of space opera in the last 20 odd years. Revelation Space, I've read the 4 main books. Enjoyed all of them, but the first one probably is my favorite. I just really love the setting up of the story, the setting up of the tone, which I find to be quite dark compared to a lot of other space operas, and the big mystery surrounding this story. Also by Reynolds, Aversion, which is a lot smaller, a lot tighter. I can't tell you what it's about because it is very liable to spoilers, but it is a fascinating, trippy book, and I really recommend you try Aversion if you want like just a 400-page palette cleanser or something like that. Flowers for Algernon, talk about a story that tugs at the heartstrings. This had me like, you know, welling up at the end of the story. Really emotional, very low on the sci-fi, and very much a deep exploration into intelligence and what it means to people. Amazing book. I'd love to reread that. Parable of the Talents, the second book in the Earthseed duology by Octavia Butler. I love the end of the world. I love apocalyptic or dystopian type fiction. This one is a very, very dark look at the possible future that we could have, kind of based around a lot of climate change and also just, you know, governments being fucking dicks. And finally, we have Project Hail Mary, which is the complete opposite to that book, which is a fun, fast-paced sci-fi with a lot of sci-fi elements, but still extremely digestible, and a wonderful friendship at the heart of the story. I love Project Hail Mary, and I love The Martian, but this one was my favorite of the two, just. So those are my honorable mentions. So what is book number 1? If you've watched my channel at all, you probably know what it is. It is my favorite book of all time, and it is 1984 by George Orwell. I read this when I was about 15 or 16 for the first time, and I've read it 4 or 5 times since then as well, and it doesn't get any worse on reread. It only gets better. I'm kind of struggling to think that a book will surpass it. Hopefully something will in the future, but at the moment, nothing comes close to making me feel how I felt when I was reading this book. You know, it is very depressing, but I do quite like depressing books, but it just felt so prescient, felt so real, felt like he was talking to the plights of the common person and what it means to be living in suppressed societies. I just think it's a genius work of fiction that has stood the test of time and is still relevant and just gripping in a very, you know, nasty kind of way. You're scared of turning the page, but you want to anyway. Morbid fascination, that's the word I was thinking for. I don't really know what to say. Everybody knows this book. Everybody knows what it's about. For me, it is just an absolutely exemplary work of fiction that everybody should read. I know not everybody will absolutely love it, but I think it is just absolutely perfect. Yeah, this is my favorite book of all time, and obviously my number one sci-fi book, 1984. So we've made it to the end of the video. If you've made it this far, I thank you so much. I really appreciate you watching until the end. Let me know what you think about this list. Let me know if you've read any of these books and agree that they should be on a top 10 list. If you disagree, I'm sure there are plenty of you out there, then let me know as well. If there's something not on the list, I probably haven't read it or didn't like it. So if you want to know why, then pop it in the comments and we'll have a conversation there. So yes, that's it. If you're new to the channel, please think about subscribing. If you liked the video, please like it. If you didn't like it, just move on. There's no need to press that dislike button. But that is it for today. Thank you again, and I'll see you in another video soon. Goodbye.